The biting wind tore through the thin fabric of Alara's worn dress, carrying the faint, tantalizing scent of roasted meats and perfumed air from the districts she could only see from a distance. It was a world away, separated not just by cobblestones and canals, but by an invisible wall of wealth and privilege that felt insurmountable. Her stomach ached with a familiar emptiness, a constant companion in the shadowed alleys she called home. Every sunrise brought the same harsh reality, another day of scavenging, of hoping for scraps, of watching others glide by in carriages draped in silks, their laughter echoing like a cruel melody in the damp air. The injustice of it all was a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the life she was born into and the life she was born without. Yet, somewhere within that gnawing hunger and chilling despair, a flicker of defiance refused to be extinguished. This is her story, a testament to the fire that can burn even in the deepest shadows. If you believe in the power of resilience and the pursuit of a just world, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more journeys from the depths to the light. The city was a creature of two faces. One, a gleaming monument of polished marble and stained glass windows, where fountains played and silk-clad figures moved with effortless grace. The other, a labyrinth of crumbling stone, perpetually damp and smelling of refuse and desperation. Alara knew only the latter. There, standing in the shadows, she would watch the parades of wealth. Carriages rolled by, their wheels silent on the clean streets, pulled by horses with gleaming coats. From within, she would occasionally catch a glimpse of the rich ladies, women adorned in impossibly smooth silks, their fingers heavy with rings that caught the light, their faces soft and unburdened by the harsh lines of want. Their laughter drifted across the divide, light and carefree, a sound utterly foreign to Alara's world. One afternoon, sheltering from a sudden downpour under a leaking awning, she saw one such lady emerge from a grand shop, wrapped in a shawl the color of spun gold. It shimmered even in the gray light, a whisper of luxury that seemed to mock the rags Alara wore. The rich lady's gaze swept across the street, not seeing the figures huddled in the doorways, her eyes vacant of recognition or concern for the world just yards away. It was not malice, Alara realized with a pang, but simply an utter obliviousness, a blindness born of never knowing anything else. The silk, the perfume, the effortless movement. The rich lady was a walking symbol of everything Alara lacked, everything that seemed forever out of reach. The injustice wasn't just the hunger or the cold. It was the sheer distance between their lives, the chasm that wealth created, leaving one side in sun-drenched comfort and the other in perpetual shadow. Alara pulled her thin arms tighter around herself, the ache in her stomach intensifying, fueled now not just by hunger, but by a quiet, simmering resentment. The world felt deeply unfair, a stage where some were born to dance in silk and others to merely shiver in its long, cold shadow. The gnawing emptiness in Alara's belly was a constant companion, a dull ache that shadowed every waking moment. Each breath she took seemed thinner than the last in the biting wind that whistled through the gaps in their makeshift shelter. It offered little protection against the damp chill that settled deep in her bones, smelling perpetually of cold earth and decay. Her clothes, threadbare and patched countless times, felt like mere wisps against the harsh bite of the elements. The only warmth came from huddling close to her younger sibling, whose small body trembled not just from the cold, but from the fever that had taken hold days ago. Each raspy cough that escaped their lips sent a fresh wave of dread washing over Alara. Worry was the heavy cloak she wore, heavier than any physical burden. It pressed down on her shoulders, blurring the edges of her vision, making it hard to see beyond the immediate, overwhelming need. Food was scarce, a desperate hunt through discarded scraps and withered plants, yielding barely enough to keep the faintest flicker of life. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in fully, one eye always open, listening for sounds in the oppressive darkness, the rustle of scavengers, the whisper of the wind, or worse, the dreaded footsteps of those who preyed on the vulnerable. The unfairness of it all was a bitter taste on her tongue, sharper than any hunger pangs. Why them? What had they done to deserve this unending struggle, this relentless tide of hardship that threatened to drown them? Today, the immediate threat loomed larger than the persistent cold or the empty gut. Her siblings' breathing was shallower, the fever spiking to a dangerous intensity. She knew, with a chilling certainty that pierced through the haze of her exhaustion, that they needed the medicinal herbs found only near the cluster of ruins on the hill. Terrain patrolled by the overseer's guards, known for their cruelty towards trespassers. It was a forbidden zone, yet the herbs were the only chance, a fragile hope against the encroaching darkness of illness. Desperation coiled tight in her chest, a knot of fear and fierce determination. She clutched the worn pouch tighter in her hand, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs as she crept closer to the perimeter of the forbidden area. The air grew colder here, thin and sharp with the scent of fear and unyielding authority. She spotted a guard near the path leading to the ruins, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape with a cold, indifferent gaze. He was a brute known as Kale, his face etched with a permanent sneer, his voice a low growl. As she tried to slip past unseen, a loose stone skittered under her foot, the sharp sound cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Kale's head snapped towards her, his eyes narrowing.
Well, well, look what we have here. A little mouse trying to sneak into the lion's den.
His voice was rough, laced with amusement that sent shivers down her spine.
Didn't you hear the orders? This area is off limits. Unless you think the rules don't apply to tattered things like you.
The immediate problem was clear, brutal, and terrifyingly real. Survival wasn't just about finding food or staying warm. It was about navigating a world designed to crush her. A world where even the smallest glimmer of hope, like medicine for a sick child, was held captive by those who reveled in their power. Facing Kale, the overwhelming odds against her survival, against her siblings' survival, became a tangible, suffocating presence. A harsh reality she had to confront head-on with nothing but her own frail courage. The wind whipped around Ilara's thin frame, biting through the threadbare shawl she clutched tightly. Her stomach gnawed with a familiar, empty ache, a constant companion in the cold, gray world she inhabited. Dust clung to her rough-spun skirt, a testament to many long days spent scavenging for scraps. Her boots, little more than worn leather shells, offered scant protection against the damp earth. She stood just outside the high stone wall, the imposing barrier that marked the boundary between her existence and another. A sudden sound drew her eye, the rhythmic clop of hooves on paved stone, a sound rarely heard on the muddy lanes she knew. A grand carriage, drawn by two magnificent sleek horses, emerged from the imposing gates of the estate. The carriage gleamed with polished wood and brass fittings, a stark, beautiful contrast to the muted, drab world around her. And within it, framed by the elegant window, sat Lady Evelyn. Ilara's breath caught. She had heard whispers, seen glimpses from afar, but never like this. Lady Evelyn was an ethereal figure, swathed in fabrics that shimmered even in the weak afternoon light. A cloak of what looked like genuine fur draped around her shoulders, its deep color rich and plush. Jewels caught the light at her neck and wrists, tiny points of fire against her delicate skin. A faint, sweet scent, entirely alien to the smells of smoke and damp earth that usually filled Ilara's world, seemed to drift on the air as the carriage passed. Lady Evelyn leaned back against sumptuous velvet cushions, her face serene, untouched by worry or want. An expression of effortless grace rested upon her features. The carriage rolled past, its wheels barely making a sound on the smooth road. Ilara watched it go, her own body a rigid, frozen knot of conflicting emotions. The cold around her seemed to deepen, not just from the wind, but from the icy realization of the vast gulf between them. Why? The silent question burned in her mind, a searing heat in the pit of her empty stomach. Why did one person have so much, effortlessly, while another scraped and starved for the very air they breathed? Hurt, sharp and sudden, pierced through her hunger. It wasn't just unfair. It felt like a deliberate cruelty, a cosmic joke played at her expense. Lady Evelyn knew nothing of hunger, nothing of the gnawing fear that each day might be her last without warmth or food. She floated through life on cushions of privilege, blind to the suffering just beyond her walls. A bitter taste filled Ilara's mouth, sharper than any wild herb she had ever chewed. The ache in her stomach intensified, no longer just hunger, but a painful manifestation of her powerlessness. A wave of despair washed over her, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. The world was built on this cruel, inexplicable imbalance. Yet, as the carriage disappeared from view, a tiny spark, born of that same pain and despair, flickered within her. A spark of something hot and sharp. Not just sorrow, but a defiant, silent challenge against the unfairness that choked her. The dust motes danced in the one thin shaft of light that pierced the perpetual gloom of the small, confined space she inhabited. Each particle a silent witness to her existence, yet none truly seeing her. Ilara moved through her days like a ghost, her footsteps muffled, her voice hushed by years of disuse and suppression. A quiet pain resided deep within her chest, a dull ache that had become as constant and familiar as the rhythm of her own breathing. It wasn't the sharp agony of a fresh wound, but the heavy, unyielding pressure of stone on a fragile flower, slowly crushing the life out of its petals. She was there, undeniably, a physical presence, yet the world seemed to look right through her, her needs unheard, her aspirations unseen. Her dreams, once vibrant tapestries woven with threads of hope and ambition, now lay folded and faded in a forgotten corner of her mind. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of their former brilliance in a quiet moment, a sudden memory of a path not taken, a possibility extinguished. The phantom touch of a paintbrush she longed to hold, the imagined scent of distant lands she yearned to explore, the echo of a confident voice that was not her own. These specters haunted her, reminders of the life she was being denied. Each memory was a tiny pinprick, adding to the steady thrum of her quiet pain. There were moments when the sheer weight of her situation felt utterly unbearable. A simple task that highlighted her limitations A dismissive glance from someone who held power over her fate. The crushing silence after she dared to voice a timid hope. These instances could trigger a suffocating wave of despair. Her throat would tighten, her breath catching in her lungs, and the world would narrow to a single desperate point of feeling. The air would grow thick, tasting metallic and cold, and the urge to scream, to rage against the unfairness, would rise like a tide, threatening to drown her in its fury. But the scream never escaped. It remained trapped within, a silent explosion behind her eyes, adding another layer to the unseen tears that never fell. This constant suppression, this invisible burden, amplified the sense of injustice. How could something so profoundly painful be so utterly ignored by the world? Her silent suffering was a testament to a system that failed to see, that chose not to hear. The hopelessness wasn't just about her own plight. It was the despair of realizing that quiet pain, unseen tears, and suppressed dreams held no currency in the harsh realities of her world. She was invisible, and in her invisibility lay the profound, crushing weight of her own silent sorrow, a sorrow that spoke volumes about the injustice she endured every single day. The air grew heavy near the old sea cliffs. A damp, earthy smell mingling with the sharp tang of salt spray carried on a rising wind. Ilara, far from the manicured lawns and the watchful eyes of the main house, felt the familiar ache in her shoulders as she wrestled with stubborn gorse bushes encroaching on a seldom-used path. The roar of the waves below was a constant, powerful presence, a stark contrast to the hushed, stifling quiet of the estate's grand halls. Here, the world felt raw and indifferent to human concerns, a place where nature held dominion. She hadn't expected anyone else in this neglected corner, least of all the mistress of the house. Yet, a flicker of movement further along the crumbling path caught her eye. Lady Evelyn, strangely alone, moved with a careless grace that seemed utterly out of place against the rugged terrain. She was dressed in a light, expensive fabric that billowed slightly in the breeze, utterly unsuited for the treacherous ground. Ilara paused, her hand hovering over a thorny branch, a knot tightening in her stomach. There was an unsettling stillness about the scene, a feeling of impending disquiet. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping strands of hair across Ilara's face. On the path ahead, Lady Evelyn stumbled, her high-heeled shoes finding no purchase on the loose scree. A small cry was snatched away by the wind. She reached out instinctively, her hand scraping against the rough rock face of the cliff edge. More stones dislodged, rattling downwards towards the churning sea. The sound was sharp, alarming. Ilara watched, frozen, for a terrible second, as Lady Evelyn's footing gave way completely. Her eyes widened in sudden, stark terror, a chilling sight so different from the composed disdain Ilara usually saw there. The fine fabric of her dress snagged briefly on a thorny bush, the very gorse Ilara had been clearing, before tearing with a sickening rip. A desperate, choked sound escaped Lady Evelyn's lips as she began to slide, picking up speed, down the steep, unstable incline towards the unforgiving rocks below. The air filled with the smell of crushed earth and the sudden sharp scent of fear. It was a life-threatening crisis unfolding in terrifying silence. The only sounds the wind, the waves, and the dreadful scuttling of loose stones. Fate had brought them together on this precarious edge, and in that horrifying moment, Ilara, was the only person who could witness, and perhaps intervene. A sickening groan tore through the air, a sound of aged wood giving way under immense sudden strain. It wasn't the gentle creak of an old building settling. It was a violent, splintering shriek that announced imminent collapse. The world seemed to tilt. Dust billowed instantly, thick and choking, stinging the eyes and coating the tongue with the taste of dry decay. Panic erupted around the crumbling structure, a wave of gasps and frightened cries. High above the chaotic ground, where a grand, ancient balcony had just been, Lady Evelyn hung, impossibly suspended. A single, twisted beam caught precariously between the remaining wall and the emptiness below was all that prevented her from plunging into the dark chasm. Her grip, thin and desperate, white-knuckled the splintered wood. Her face, usually serene, was contorted in terror, eyes wide with the shock of the abyss. The cold reality of her immediate peril slammed into the onlookers. She was utterly exposed, vulnerable, her life a fragile thread taut over disaster. Fear rippled through the crowd, turning horrified spectators into frozen statues or scattering figures. Shouts echoed, but they were cries of warning, of disbelief, of self-preservation. No one moved towards her. The air thrummed with unspoken dread. It was too high, too dangerous. The remaining structure groaned again, a fresh shower of dust and small stones raining down. A harsh sound against the terrified silence of the frozen onlookers. The stench of old rot and damp earth rose from the void below. Lady Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps, her grip visibly weakening.
Help me. Oh, please.
Her voice was a fragile plea lost in the wind. The desperate sound clawed at the senses, demanding a response. Yet none came from the retreating figures. Their fear was a palpable wall, thicker than the dust. The beam supporting her shifted again, a sickening crunch echoing the initial collapse. It wouldn't hold much longer. The light seemed to dim, casting long, ominous shadows that mirrored the darkness gathering in her fading eyes. Time stretched and distorted, each second, a pounding drumbeat, counting down to oblivion. The chasm yawned, a greedy mouth ready to swallow her whole. Then a surge. A single figure broke from the paralyzed crowd, not away from the danger, but towards it. Not because they were fearless, but because the image of Lady Evelyn's desperate plight was a brand seared into their mind. Ignoring the shouts of warning, the collapsing debris, and the ice-cold grip of their own fear, they lunged onto the unstable remnants of the platform. Every instinct screamed retreat, every muscle tensed with primal terror, but the will to act was a furnace hotter than any fear. Scrabbling across the uneven, treacherous surface, they reached the edge, stretching out a hand, fingers brushing against the rough wood, then finding Lady Evelyn's trembling wrist. Her skin was cold and clammy to the touch, a stark sensation amidst the gritty dust and sharp edges. The strain on their arm was immense, the weight of her body a heavy burden against the pull of gravity. The beam groaned its final protest. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, ignoring the pain and the imminent threat of the platform giving way beneath them, they pulled. Pulled, with the strength born of sheer necessity, of seeing a life balanced on the edge and refusing to let it fall. Debris scattered. The beam finally snapped away with a final echoing crash into the depths below. But Lady Evelyn was no longer hanging by a thread. She was pulled, stumbling and weak, onto the unstable platform, safe for now. The air still tasted of dust and terror, but the immediate horror had been averted by one decisive act against a tide of frozen inaction. The air grew thin, thick with the smell of damp stone and something acrid, like burnt metal and fear. Below, the treacherous footing crumbled further. A sickening sound echoed in the close space, the scrape of boots against loosening grit, followed by a startled cry that cut through the oppressive silence. Lady Evelyn, her face a mask of terror, teetered on the precipice, her grasp slipping from the fragile ledge. The fall would be absolute, crushing any hope instantly. Panic seized the onlookers, the frozen tableau of horror etched on their faces. Ilara watched, her own body aching from exertion and malnourishment, a cold tremor running through her limbs. Her pulse hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed caution, survival, to hold back from the edge, to protect the fragile strength she possessed. Her circumstances had taught her the brutal cost of vulnerability, the unforgiving nature of a world that offered no safety net to the likes of her. She was the overlooked, the easily discarded, burdened by a past that clung to her like a shroud. Acting, putting herself in harm's way, felt like signing her own death warrant in this precarious existence. But the image of Lady Evelyn's wide, despairing eyes, the raw human fear in that final, desperate sound, bypassed Ilara's conscious thought, bypassing the logic of self-preservation entirely. It was an impulse, pure and incandescent, born from a depth of compassion that defied her harsh reality. It was the core of who she was, untainted by hardship. A surge of energy, unexpected and fierce, coursed through her veins. She didn't think, she acted. With a grunt of effort, ignoring the searing protest of her muscles, Ilara lunged forward. Her hand shot out, not grasping for something to steady herself, but reaching, straining, towards the falling woman. Her fingers, calloused and strong despite her thin frame, closed around Lady Evelyn's wrist, just as she was about to plunge into the void. The sudden jarring weight nearly pulled Ilara over as well. Grit sprayed into her face, the chill rock biting into her skin as she scrambled for purchase. Every sinew screamed, every breath caught in her throat, but she held fast, anchored by sheer, unyielding will. The smell of fear was thick now, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from scraped knuckles. Slowly, painstakingly, she pulled, inch by agonizing inch, leveraging her body against the crumbling edge, the rough stone tearing at her clothes and skin. Finally, with a breathless gasp, Lady Evelyn was heaved onto a slightly more stable ledge beside Ilara. They lay there for a moment, trembling, the vast emptiness still gaping below them. The air was thick with the scent of their fear and the cold, dusty smell of the earth. Lady Evelyn stirred, her eyes blinking rapidly, disbelief warring with relief on her face. She coughed, a ragged sound, and looked at Ilara. Truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time.
You saved me.
Her voice was weak, raspy with shock, but filled with an awe that transcended their stations. Ilara, battered and exhausted, simply nodded, her own breathing shallow. Her inherent goodness, the selflessness that had driven her despite her own fragility and the indifference of the world, had manifested in this impossible moment. The immediate aftermath was silence, broken only by their ragged breaths and the distant echo of their near-fatal descent. A testament to the unexpected, courageous act that had snatched a life from the brink. The metallic tang of fear began to recede from the air, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the forest floor pressed against Alara's cheek. A profound weariness settled deep in her bones, heavier than any physical burden she had ever carried. Her muscles trembled with the strain of the desperate exertion, a dull ache throbbing in her arms and legs, a sharp counterpoint to the sludge of relief that pulsed through her veins. Beside her, Lady Evelyn, disheveled and pale, shivered despite the thick embroidered fabric of her gown. Her eyes were wide with lingering shock, fixed on the dark opening they had escaped, the sound of her own ragged breaths loud in the sudden stillness. Slowly, Lady Evelyn turned, her gaze finding Alara sprawled on the ground. The initial wild panic in her eyes softened into something resembling gratitude, though it was filtered through the lens of someone unaccustomed to such raw, terrifying moments. She reached out a trembling hand, her fine rings catching the faint light filtering through the trees.
Merciful heavens, you saved me. You actually saved me. It was horrendous. I thought I was lost forever. Thank you, child. Truly, profoundly, thank you.
Her voice was reedy, higher than usual, still laced with the remnants of terror. Yet beneath it lay an almost dismissive air, as if the ordeal was an inconvenience she had been rescued from, rather than a life she had been pulled back to. Alara pushed herself up onto shaky elbows, the rough fabric of her worn sleeves scraping against her skin. Exhaustion clouded her vision, and the world seemed to tilt slightly, but a flicker of hope ignited within her chest, bright and fierce. Surely, this act of saving a noblewoman of high standing would be the turning point, the moment her fortunes changed. It had to be. She swallowed, her throat dry and scratchy, the taste of dust still clinging to her tongue. She looked at the noblewoman, her eyes filled with a plea she tried to keep quiet, a desperate hope shining through her fatigue.
My lady, I am grateful to have found you and hoped. It was harrowing.
She paused, gathering her courage, the aching in her body a constant reminder of her own precarious state.
I have nothing now. You see, no home, no coin. I was fleeing my own hardship. I truly hoped. Perhaps this might...
She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the depth of her need, the expectation that saving such a valuable life would surely warrant protection, recompense, a chance. A subtle shift occurred in Lady Evelyn's expression. The effusive gratitude seemed to dim slightly, replaced by a flicker of something less comfortable, perhaps bordering on irritation. She pulled her hand back, smoothing her torn dress with nervous fingers. The air grew perceptibly cooler around them, the brief warmth of shared peril dissipating as the reality of Alara's plea settled between them like a sudden, unwelcome mist. The air around Lady Evelyn suddenly felt sharper, thinner, losing the strained warmth it had held during the recent peril. Her eyes, moments ago wide with concern, now held a cool, assessing glint as she looked down at Alara. The immediate danger had passed, and with it, the brief, fragile bridge built between mistress and servant. The silence that fell was heavy, a stark contrast to the recent chaos, punctuated only by the distant sounds of servants righting fallen objects and extinguishing lingering embers. Alara stood before her, heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and a faint, desperate thread of hope. Surely her actions, the risk she had taken, would be seen, understood. Lady Evelyn extended a hand, her movements precise and devoid of emotion. In her palm lay a single small copper coin, dull and worn. It was less than a day's wage, barely enough to buy a loaf of stale bread. The smooth, cold metal felt like ice against Alara's calloused palm as Lady Evelyn pressed it into her hand. There was no warmth in the gesture, no acknowledgement of the life she had saved, no recognition of the gulf between this paltry sum and the crushing weight of debt that threatened to swallow her whole.
A small token for your assistance, girl. You reacted adequately. Now see that the scullery is properly cleaned before sundown. There's much to be done, and we can't afford idleness simply because of a minor inconvenience.
The words landed not as a reward, but as a dismissal, colder than the coin in her hand. Adequate, a minor inconvenience. Did she not see the smoke stinging Alara's lungs, the searing heat that had licked at her skin, the sheer terror that had coiled in her gut as she faced the immediate threat? Did she not understand that every moment Alara spent here, earning pennies, was time stolen from the desperate struggle to keep her family from ruin? The hope that had flickered within Alara died a swift, brutal death. It wasn't just the inadequacy of the coin, it was the utter blindness to her reality, the complete lack of empathy. A profound hurt bloomed in Alara's chest, sharp and suffocating. It was worse than the fear she had felt moments ago. This was the pain of being invisible, of being utterly, completely misunderstood by the very person who held her fragile fate in their hands. The copper coin felt heavy now, a mocking weight, symbolizing not gratitude, but indifference. The air grew thick with the unspoken disappointment that lodged itself in Alara's throat. She looked at the coin, then at Lady Evelyn's impassive face, and the world seemed to tilt, suddenly stark and unforgiving. The lingering smell of smoke seemed to mingle with the bitter taste of betrayal on her tongue. She had poured her courage, her very being, into saving this woman, this house, and all she received was a pittance and a reminder of her lowly station. The path ahead, she now knew with crushing certainty, would be even colder, even harder than she had ever imagined. The cobblestones of the lower city felt rough and uneven beneath Alara's worn soles, a stark contrast to the polished marble she had recently traversed. The air here was thick with the smell of damp earth and refuse, the distant clang of metal on metal, a constant reminder of the grinding labor that defined existence. Each step back into the familiar gloom felt heavy, not just with physical weariness, but with a disappointment that settled deep in her bones. Heavier than any burden she had ever carried. She had faced genuine peril, stared down creatures that stalked the forgotten places of the world, all for a fleeting glimpse of a life that felt impossibly distant now. The meager reward, a pittance compared to the risks taken, felt like a cruel jest. She had put her life on the line, bared her soul to the unknown, and for what? A temporary reprieve, a brief, dizzying ascent before the inevitable tumble back down. The images of grand halls, soft silks, and tables laden with food flashed in her mind, juxtaposed cruelly against the peeling paint of her rented room and the gnawing ache of hunger that was a permanent resident in her belly. The gap between her world and theirs wasn't just physical. It was a chasm of understanding, of privilege, of sheer, unthinking ease that mocked her struggle. But what stung most wasn't the disparity itself, which she had always known existed. It was the direct, chilling experience of their indifference. It wasn't active cruelty, but a passive turning away, a swift dismissal once her task was done. They had looked at her with a fleeting interest while she was useful. Then their gaze had simply drifted away, leaving her feeling like a discarded tool. That blank lack of concern, the inability or unwillingness to see her as a person who had bled and feared and hoped, compounded the hurt exponentially. It made the risks feel not just unrewarded, but unseen, unvalued. The shadows she returned to felt colder now, not just because they were dark, but because she carried the weight of a world that saw her only when it suited its needs, and then forgot her existence entirely. A quiet fire, fueled by this cold indifference, began to smolder beneath the layers of weariness and hurt. The dust settled slowly from the commotion, catching the afternoon light in golden motes that danced in the still air. A hushed quiet fell over the onlookers, who moments ago had gasped and whispered. Relief, thick and palpable, began to replace the sharp edge of fear that had gripped the scene. Lady Evelyn remained where she stood, slightly apart, her expression carefully neutral. A stark contrast to the trembling gratitude on the face of the person who had just been pulled from danger. She watched with her usual cool detachment as others stepped forward, offering aid with simple, calloused hands or speaking words of comfort in gentle tones. There was no calculation in their movements, no thought for advantage, only an instinctive, unvarnished humanity. The air carried the scent of damp earth and nervous sweat, mingling oddly with the crisp perfume she wore, a fragrance that suddenly felt too sharp, too artificial. One young woman, barely more than a girl, knelt beside the rescued figure, offering a worn blanket and a cup of water from a flask she carried. Her eyes held a deep, empathetic concern that was utterly foreign to Lady Evelyn's world. She saw the grateful nod in return, the weak but genuine smile. It was a small interaction, mundane perhaps, but it caught Lady Evelyn's gaze and held it. A strange sensation pricked at her, like a tiny splinter beneath the skin of her conscience. It was not guilt, not yet, but a disturbing flicker of something unfamiliar. The satisfaction she usually derived from maintaining her distance, from viewing such scenes with clinical indifference, felt curiously absent. Instead, there was a faint tremor in her hand, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cool breeze that had begun to stir. She had always seen life as a transaction, emotions as weaknesses to be exploited or dismissed. Yet watching this simple exchange of kindness, she felt a disquieting fissure open in her carefully constructed worldview. The pure, unadulterated relief radiating from the rescued person. The simple, unassuming generosity of the girl with the blanket. These were elements she had never truly accounted for. They didn't fit into her equation of power and control. A cold knot formed in her stomach. A different kind of cold than her usual emotional frost. It was the unease of encountering something true and powerful that she couldn't manipulate or dismiss. For the first time, the reflection staring back from the surface of a nearby puddle seemed less like the formidable Lady Evelyn and more like a stranger, one whose carefully composed mask had just begun to crack, letting the first unsettling tendrils of doubt creep in. The subtle hum of the crowd's receding murmurs sounded less like background noise and more like distant, questioning voices. The hushed tones began subtly, like dry leaves skittling across cold stone. News, borne on the same invisible currents that carried scents of damp earth and distant fires, started to spread. First, it was the story of Alara, the simple girl who had offered her own slender savings, earned by the sweat of her brow, to ease a burden she barely understood. A quiet act of pure heart, whispered with a reverence that warmed the air around it. Then, colder, sharper, came the tale of Lady Evelyn's response, the cutting dismissal, the outright cruelty that had withered Elara's hopeful offer like frost upon a delicate bloom. The contrast was stark, a harsh discord that grated on the ears of those who heard it. Disapproval, a heavy cloak woven from gossip and indignation, settled over the village and began to extend its reach. It traveled beyond the familiar cottages and fields, carried by merchants on muddy roads, by servants visiting neighboring estates, even finding its way into letters exchanged between polite society. The sheer lack of grace, the chilling indifference shown by one of such supposed standing, left a sour taste in the mouths of listeners. Across the rolling hills, in a study lined with weighty tomes and the scent of aged paper, sat Lord Ashworth, a man whose influence stretched further than most knew, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper memory. He had known Lady Evelyn's family for decades, held certain understandings, and possessed a quiet authority that few dared challenge. A letter lay open on his desk, its contents briefly detailing the recent unpleasantness involving a village girl and Lady Evelyn's rather public display of disdain. A frown deepened the lines around his eyes. He remembered certain things about Evelyn from years past, things that added a layer of complexity to her current behavior, things that hinted at a hidden vulnerability beneath the brittle facade of arrogance. This news, reaching his ears, he saw not just a callous act, but perhaps a symptom. The air in his study, usually tranquil, now felt charged with a quiet tension as he penned a crisp note, his quill scratching decisively across the parchment. This external force, this man of influence who had just received a fragment of the truth, began to apply a subtle yet undeniable pressure. He didn't command or threaten, but his questions, his inquiries about the matter sent ripples through the established order, stirring the stagnant waters around Lady Evelyn's carefully constructed world. For Lady Evelyn, unaware of the precise source of the growing unease, the atmosphere began to shift. The usual deference felt strained. Smiles seemed less genuine. There was a new, unnerving coolness in interactions. A prickle of unease, sharp as a needle, began to pierce through her self-possession. The whispers, she sensed, were no longer just about the girl. They were now about her, dissecting her actions, her character. The light being shed by unseen eyes felt uncomfortably bright, illuminating corners she preferred to keep hidden, pushing relentlessly towards a truth she desperately wished to keep buried. The grand hall felt suddenly oppressive, its opulence mocking the chill that settled deep within Lady Evelyn's bones. She had sought a moment's quiet reflection near the seldom-used library, her mind wrestling with the low hum of discontent that had recently begun to needle her conscience. Then she heard voices, hushed but sharp, drifting from within the library's heavy oak doors. Curiosity warred with a sense of impropriety, but something compelled her to listen. It was Lady Mallory's voice, laced with a disturbing glee.
And the girl is practically wasting away, I hear. Ill and with nowhere proper to turn. Her family won't lift a finger after the disgrace.
Another voice, a man's, chuckled dismissively.
Good. Let that be a lesson. Thought she could rise above her station, did she?
Evelyn's blood ran cold. Wasting away? Ill? She had seen Elara's struggles. Yes, the social slights, the whispers, the isolation. But she had rationalized it, told herself it was merely discomfort, the price of ambition, or perhaps a temporary setback. She had been part of the crowd that had pushed Elara to the edges, her own silence a complicity she had chosen to ignore. The air in the corridor grew thick, tasting of dust and ancient regret. The casual cruelty in their voices painted a vivid, horrifying picture of Ilara's true circumstances. Not just social inconvenience, but genuine, potentially life-threatening hardship, orchestrated and celebrated by the very society Evelyn inhabited. A tremor ran through her hands. The weight of her own actions, her own passive acceptance of the cruelty, crashed down upon her. She saw Ilara's face in her mind, not the determined young woman who had aspired to more, but a pale, fragile figure shivering in the cold, abandoned and suffering. The gilded cage of her own life, which had always felt secure, now felt suffocating, built on a foundation of calculated indifference and the silent crushing of others. Every averted glance, every word left unsaid, every moment she had chosen comfort over courage, now burned with accusation. The moral rot she had pretended not to see was not just in others. It was in herself. In that moment, standing unseen in the shadows, a decisive change solidified within her. The shallow concerns that had occupied her evaporated like mist in the sun. The fear of social repercussions, the comfort of conformity, they suddenly seemed utterly insignificant against the stark reality of a life being destroyed by the callousness she had allowed herself to be part of. This could not stand. She could not, would not, be a participant in this silent devastation any longer. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps fraught with the very social dangers she had always avoided, but her conscience, finally awakened with a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror, demanded action. There was no turning back from the truth she had just heard. Her intention shifted, dramatically, irrevocably. She had to help Ilara, no matter the cost to herself. The weight of her conscience was a burden she was finally ready to bear. A formal scroll, tied with a heavy, unfamiliar ribbon, lay upon the small table. Ilara stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Messengers did not typically bring such things to her simple dwelling. A tremor started in her hands, a reflex action triggered by the ornate wax seal. It was the crest of Lady Evelyn. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, sharp and debilitating. The memory of her last encounter with Lady Evelyn resurfaced unbidden. The sterile air of the grand hall, the chillingly indifferent expression, the dismissive words that had shattered her hopes and pride into a million pieces. She could almost hear the echo of that polite but absolute rejection, the way her dreams had been swept away like dust. It had taken her months to stitch together the remnants of her courage, to find a fragile foothold in a world that had suddenly felt vast and hostile. Now this, a summons. What could the lady possibly want? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. Was it some twisted amusement? Had she heard Ilara was finally finding her feet again and decided to deliver another blow? The possibilities, all steeped in the bitter flavor of past humiliation, churned in her mind. Suspense coiled around her like a serpent, its scales cold against her skin. She felt utterly exposed, the thin shield of her newfound resilience seeming pitifully inadequate against the potential force of Lady Evelyn's will. The paper felt heavy in her hands as she finally reached for it, the texture rough against her fingertips. The ink on the page seemed stark and demanding. Her eyes blurred slightly as she read the concise request for her presence, a specific time, a specific place within the sprawling estate. There was no hint of purpose, no explanation, just the stark command. It felt less like an invitation and more like a decree, pulling her back into an orbit she had fought so hard to escape. She was the underdog again, small and vulnerable against a power that had already crushed her once. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, difficult to breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore the summons, to hide away until the threat passed. But a deeper, more stubborn part of her, forged in the fires of past pain, knew she had to go. The uncertainty was a torment she couldn't bear indefinitely. Dressing was an act performed in a daze, her movements stiff and hesitant. The familiar path towards the estate seemed longer, the grand gates more imposing than ever. The sounds of the bustling town faded behind her, replaced by the anxious pounding of her own heart and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees, a sound that felt mournful and foreboding. Each step was a battle against the rising tide of dread, the fear of what awaited her behind those cold, elegant walls. She approached the entrance, her resolve a fragile thing, steeling herself for whatever fresh pain Lady Evelyn might have planned. The air in the opulent room thickened, heavy with unspoken expectations and the scent of polished mahogany and wilting lilies. Everyone present had anticipated a consequence, perhaps a harsh word, a severance of ties, a public shaming even, for the actions of the greedy relatives and the hardship they had caused. But no one, least of all the young woman who had suffered so deeply, could have predicted the turn of events unfolding before them. Lady Evelyn, whose initial demeanor had been as cold and unyielding as glacial ice, now stood, her posture softened, a flicker of something akin to sorrow in her eyes that had once held only disdain. She took a slow breath, the rustle of her silk dress a whisper in the silence. Her gaze settled upon the young woman, a look that seemed to penetrate the years of struggle and pain etched onto her face. It was a look of profound recognition, perhaps of a shared humanity, finally acknowledged. Then the words came, not the clicked, dismissive tones of the past, but a voice imbued with unexpected warmth, a resonance that filled the room and settled deep within the chests of those listening.
What has transpired here, the cruelty and deceit, is beyond forgiveness in the conventional sense. But justice, true justice, is not merely about punishment. It is about restoration. It is about turning darkness into light.
A collective gasp rippled through the room. The conniving relatives shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale with a fear far greater than they had felt mere moments ago. This was not the simple cutting off they had braced for. Lady Evelyn's eyes, though soft, held an unwavering resolve.
Therefore, I will not simply disinherit those who have caused such suffering. That would be too simple.
She paused, her voice gaining strength.
Will be used to build a future for you.
The young woman's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She blinked, trying to process the words.
I am establishing a foundation in your name. It will be endowed with a significant portion of my estate, more than enough to secure your comfort and prosperity for life. But that is not all. I am also arranging for you to take a position within the philanthropic arm of my company, a position of leadership where your experiences, your resilience, your understanding of hardship can guide its efforts. You will oversee initiatives aimed at helping others who have faced similar injustices.
The magnitude of the offer washed over the young woman, staggering her. It wasn't just financial security. It was purpose, opportunity, and a platform to turn her pain into a force for good. It was a complete reversal, a karma so potent it felt like a physical wave washing over her.
You will have the resources, the authority, and the support to make a real difference in the world. The very wealth that was hoarded and misused will now become a source of light and hope, directed by the one it was unjustly taken from.
Her voice trembled, tears blurring her vision, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and disbelief. This was not vengeance. It was a magnificent, unexpected resurgence, a complete reclamation of everything lost, multiplied tenfold. The bitter taste of past struggles suddenly seemed distant, replaced by the sweet, unbelievable reality of a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream. The cold grip of poverty and despair that had held her captive for so long finally, truly, began to loosen its hold. The journey had been arduous, filled with pain and injustice, but in this moment, standing in the warm glow of Lady Evelyn's unexpected grace, the clear moral truth resonated. Sometimes, the greatest justice was not just regaining what was lost, but being given the power to ensure others never suffered the same fate. The thick, suffocating cloak of fear that had clung to Alara for so long began slowly to dissipate. It felt like thawing ice melting away under a warm, benevolent sun. The stark, cold reality she had known was replaced by a softness she had almost forgotten existed. No longer did she flinch at sudden sounds. Instead, the gentle crackling of a nearby fire brought a sense of deep, unfamiliar peace. She felt the yielding comfort of a soft mattress beneath her. The luxurious warmth of clean blankets wrapped around her small form. The scent of herbal tea and polished wood filled the air, a stark contrast to the stale, fear-tinged scent of her recent past. Days blended into a quiet, healing rhythm. Nutritious food, warm and fragrant, was placed before her, not snatched away. Gentle hands tended to her, not struck her. Lady Evelyn herself often sat with her, not with judgment, but with a quiet presence that spoke volumes. The lines of worry on Lady Evelyn's face seemed less etched, replaced by a softness Alara hadn't believed possible. It was in these moments that Alara saw not just a benefactor, but a fellow soul carrying a heavy burden, now perhaps beginning to set it down. Alara's voice, long silenced by terror, began to tentatively return. It was raspy at first, a whisper barely audible, but Lady Evelyn listened with infinite patience.
I didn't think anyone would care.
Alara managed one afternoon, the words catching in her throat. Lady Evelyn's hand, surprisingly strong yet gentle, covered Alara's own. A profound sadness touched the older woman's eyes, quickly followed by something akin to fierce determination.
You were wrong, child. Terribly wrong, but you are safe now. Truly safe.
For Lady Evelyn, each flicker of life returning to Alara's eyes, each small smile that touched her lips, was a balm to old wounds in her own soul. The fulfillment of providing this sanctuary, of righting a terrible wrong, even indirectly, was a redemption she hadn't consciously sought. Yet it washed over her, clearing the dust of years of quiet regret. She saw in Alara not just a victim she had saved, but a mirror of a path she might have taken had kindness not intervened for her long ago. There was a silent, shared understanding growing between them, a bond forged in hardship and cemented by newfound hope. Alara's heart, though scarred, swelled with a gratitude so immense it felt like a new sunrise within her chest. The dawn had truly broken. The journey had traced a long, arduous path, winding through shadows and climbing toward light. Looking back, the raw pain of those early days felt distant, yet the echoes of the heart's trials remained, not as wounds, but as indelible lessons etched upon the soul. There was the sharp sting of betrayal, the heavy burden of undeserved hardship, the gnawing fear of being utterly alone against overwhelming odds. But in the crucible of suffering, understanding had been forged. Compassion, once a fragile tendril easily crushed by cynicism, had deepened into an unshakable root. Witnessing the vulnerability in others, even those who had caused pain, revealed the shared human struggle beneath layers of pride or cruelty. The quiet strength of a helping hand, the soft resonance of an understanding voice, these simple acts held immense power and consequence. Its weight was undeniable. Every action, every word, cast ripples across the waters of life, returning sometimes as destructive waves, sometimes as gentle, life-giving currents. Those who had sown discord reaped isolation. Those who had planted seeds of kindness watched them bloom. Yet the narrative wasn't solely one of strict retribution. There were glimmers of second chances, moments where a flicker of remorse was met not with condemnation, but with the quiet possibility of redemption. Not forgiveness that erased the past, but an acknowledgement that people could change, could learn, could choose a different path. These chances were hard-won, offered not out of weakness, but out of a deep, weary wisdom. And through it all, the unseen connections hummed, a subtle tapestry woven between lives seemingly disparate. The person in rags and the figure in fine silk were linked by shared desires for dignity, for belonging, for peace. A single selfless act, born in a moment of desperation, had resonated outwards, touching lives far beyond its immediate reach, sparking a chain reaction of hope and justice. The transformed heart, once burdened by resentment, now beat with a steady rhythm of gratitude and resilience, understanding that the greatest strength lay not in overpowering others, but in cultivating inner peace and extending grace. The air itself seemed lighter now, carrying the whisper of lessons learned, a poignant melody echoing the long journey toward healing and understanding. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, casting long shadows that spoke of endings, yet held the promise of dawn. Life's storms had passed, leaving behind a quiet calm. The world felt different now, not because the world itself had changed, but because the eyes perceiving it had. The weight lifted from the shoulders was replaced by a quiet strength residing deep within. There was a profound understanding that every trial endured, every act of courage shown, every moment of compassion offered, had been part of a larger, unseen design, guiding the heart toward its true north. The echoes of the past remained, but they were no longer cries of pain. They were soft reminders of resilience, quiet affirmations of growth. A deep, abiding peace settled, a sense of completion, not just of a story, but of a vital, life-altering journey. The journey had ended, but the lessons, carried in the heart, would last a lifetime.